welcome to the programme. We've had numerous conversations over the past year here on World Have Your Say about conflicts and unrest around the world, from Syria to Afghanistan and Iraq, South Sudan and the CAR. But is there hope for peace in 2014? And if so, which countries have the best chance? We're going to be speaking to guests in Boston, in Juba and in Jerusalem. And if you live in an area of conflict, what do you hope and indeed expect from the year ahead? You can add your thoughts to the many that are already on Facebook and on Twitter, or alternatively, you can send us a message via WhatsApp.
Talking about it. Top priority.
I experience.
This is chaos. People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Welcome to the programme. Good to have your company here on World Have Your Say. If you want to get involved, as ever, you know the places to get in touch. All of your comments will come to me here, and we'll try and put as many of them to our guests over the next hour when we're here live on BBC World News. Let me introduce you to the guests that we have. Greg Marinovich is an author and Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, member of the Bang Bang Club in Boston. Mading Noor is a freelance journalist in Juba in South Sudan, joined us before on World Have Your Say. And Shira Frankel is the BuzzFeed Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Let's begin with Mading. You're in Juba. We heard there in the news with Matthew that talks are underway to try and bring some kind of peace resolution in South Sudan. What hopes do you have for the forthcoming year?
South Sudan has been on fire in the last few weeks. There's still no ceasefire. Fighting continues while the talks are going on in Addis Ababa. The politicians are trying to put off the fire that they started. I do believe in the end, we'll have a peaceful South Sudan.
Greg Marinovich, what are your thoughts on this?
It's a very tricky situation. It's such powerful forces within the SPLM there, and they seem at loggerheads, and it's a historic problem. And one hopes they can sort it out, or otherwise it's going to be truly disastrous there.
What about the argument? I wonder, Shira, I'll bring you in at this point. When you look at places like South Sudan, there are arguments, we've heard it all before, that the West is interested in South Sudan because there's oil. Other people would say actually places like the CAR will be ignored because there's no benefit for Western countries. Do you agree that there is an element of whether there will be success in 2014 depending on the interest of the outside world?
No, I don't think you can summarize. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think in many of these cases that it's the outside world that determines whether or not there'll be peace and stability. What you've seen over the last 5, 6, even 10 years in the Middle East is local populations making a lot of the decisions, taking matters into their own hands. That's what a lot of the upheaval and revolutions of 2011 were. Certainly the outside world getting involved can play a role, but I don't think it'll be the sole determining factor.
What about you, Greg? Do you think there's an element of the interest of the outside world dictating what may well come to a peaceful solution in 2014?
I mean, there certainly is. It's the lure of the massive amounts of money that commodities like oil bring to countries like South Sudan, which can be a great blessing in terms of becoming a viable state as the world's newest country. But it also brings the curse of the powerful trying to keep all those resources to themselves, and there comes a falling out when there's a lot of money involved. And there's the added complication of Sudan to the north, which gets its revenue from South Sudanese oil, essentially. So it's a very tricky situation. And the outside world, I'm just not sure how much power they have to dictate what should happen in South Sudan. I think it's really very internal.
Mading, do you want to pick up on that point about
the question about the role of the outside world? I think we all have to remember this is a fragile country. It's a new nation, and there is a UN mandate here to support the government institutions and to stand up for this young country. So the outside world at this point is a lot more needed. We have achieved independence that the world know about, but we are not economically independent. We are still fragile. So we do need help from the outside, and the outside world has a lot of solutions as opposed to the other way around.
Let's pull up this comment which Pope Francis made peace, the main theme of his New Year message. And he said, what on earth is happening in the hearts of men? What on earth is happening in the heart of humanity? It is time to stop. Of course, the theme of peace in a Pope's New Year message is nothing new. But is there an element, do you think, Mading, that the world is getting worse in the sense of conflict, that we are descending towards more war rather than peace?
That is the unfortunate message that we see every day. We listen to radios, we watch TV, we see Egypt next door is burning, same with Congo, and same with many countries in the region here in Africa and beyond. That is, it seems that there's more war than peace. But I do believe that there is always peace after war. That has been the case in South Sudan after 21 years of war. Long time ago, we never imagined that we will live in our own country. So anything is possible. And I do believe that we have no option but to push for peace. Whether it exists or not, we should always strive for it.
So Mading's quite positive. Greg, oh, you wanted to pick up on that, Greg?
There's got to be such a shift in how we approach these things. I mean, Sudan started off with such optimism, and I was there for the independence, and it was wonderful. And, you know, there were the Nua and Dinka and all these people who are now at conflict, all starting to build houses in the suburbs of Juba at the capital, you know, cheek by jowl to each other. And yet it's just this unbelievably quick unraveling due to greed at the top. You know, I follow some Twitter feeds from around Kenya and that, and Machar and Kir both have their families and family homes in Nairobi. I mean, what kind of a commitment is that to a country? I think this is the problem. The powerful have to change the way they approach these things.
Well, let's put that point to Michelle Fall, who's Chief Africa Correspondent at Associated Press, joins us now from the BBC's Lagos Bureau. Welcome to World Have Your Say, Michelle. I don't know how much of our conversation you've picked up on so far, but what's your view on the situation in South Sudan? Do you have a positive outlook for the year ahead?
Chloe, I think that the South Sudanese leaders, and, you know, they suffer from a failure that we, you know, are benighted with across Africa, these venal, greedy, corrupt leaders who will do anything for power and not consider the people. The people of South Sudan, you know, are going to have to force a peace. If these leaders do not come to a peaceful agreement, the oil supply of Sudan proper to the north of them will be threatened, and Sudan will attack. I think Bashir, the president of Sudan, has made it very clear that, you know, they allowed South Sudan to part from the country and you form this new nation, and they've lost all the oil riches. All of the oil riches are in South Sudan, and it was on condition that they pay a fee to Sudan for moving the oil through that country. So if they don't want to be attacked from the outside, these leaders are going to have to make peace among themselves.
You can see there's quite a delay on that line from Lagos, but we'll keep talking to Michelle. I just want to pull up this video which we've been sent by Ahmed Youssef Basir Idris, who is from Darfur in Sudan.
Hello, my name is Ahmed Youssef Basir Idris, and I'm sending this video from Darfur, Sudan. I want to talk about the problems that are taking place in South Sudan at the meantime, and I really do believe that the main reason is because of the mentality of our African leaders towards leadership. I'm sorry to say, but all our African leaders think that they're kings and they have to reach that crown no matter what the cost, without putting in mind that there are innocent people who are getting displaced, innocent people who are getting killed. So the only way to fix this is to change the mentality of those leaders. Otherwise, we'll be going into a 360 degrees infinity circle. One problem fixed here, another problem will emerge. Thank you very much.
Interesting point by Ahmed Youssef. I don't know who wants to pick up on this first, but how do you change the mentality of African leaders, as he puts it? Greg.
Yeah, I think it's the very nature of those who seek power, leaders, is to be selfish and quite, you know, rhino-skinned in many ways. And I think it's up to people to take their destiny into their own hands. Vote for those that show true leadership and not just a desire for power. I mean, really, it's up to us as the voting citizens to make these decisions at the end of the day and not to be swayed by different calls by the powerful as to why we should vote for them, as opposed to those who would really do us good.
Mading, what do you think?
I wish we had kings that were treating us better, but that is not the case here. But really, I do believe that it is about empowering the people, because what we are seeing in Africa, you have the majority not being able to read and write, not being able to follow up on day-to-day events. And I wondered to what extent the conflict that has been raging on in South Sudan has been fueled by rumors and by the sheer fact that people cannot distinguish between rumors and facts. So I do believe that if people, if the citizens know their rights and they know the issues at hand, they will challenge the leaders. And in South Sudan, you have a high number of population that is going through a lot of illiteracy. So in that circumstance, in that scenario, in that situation, the politicians are the one who are the center stage.
Michelle, when Mading's talking about high levels of illiteracy, Greg's saying that the right people need to come to the fore, but is the situation right for people to come forward? Can people who are maybe living in poverty able to rise forward and become leaders in Africa?
I think that, you know, that is one of the hopeful things about Africa, is Africa's people. And I agree with Greg that it's we Africans who are going to have to make and build our futures. And I think that they're very hopeful signs. I live in Nigeria at the moment. It's a country, you know, probably one of the most corrupt in the world. But I'm uplifted at living in a place where there are literally hundreds of civil society organizations, hundreds of them, and all of these people giving their time freely, dedicated to the idea that they, the citizens, will make their country a better place to live.
Well, do stay with us, Greg, Michelle and Mading. Lots of you getting in touch with us from Nigeria, Ghana and the US. If you're living in part of the world that is affected by conflict, what do you want to see coming in the following year, in 2014? Do you have a positive outlook for the coming year? You can tweet us using the hashtag WHYS, but stay with us. We'll be back in a few minutes.
No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something. No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. We've had a shuffle round of seats and 3 new guests are here to discuss what chances of peace there are in 2014. Rachel Shabi is in London, a journalist and author focusing on the Middle East. Mohammed Ali Harousi is Deputy Bureau Chief of the AFP News Agency, joining us from Baghdad. And Shira Frenkel is the BuzzFeed Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Welcome all of you to World Have Your Say. Mohammed, I'll go straight to you in Baghdad. Violence in Iraq very much been in the news over the past couple of days. Do you have any hope for peace in Iraq in the coming year?
I should say no. What's going on in Iraq is really very complicated. It's a mix of regional influences and domestic corrupted politics and sectarianism and violence. It's a really very complicated situation. And I don't think that there is any hope, unfortunately, in 2014 or in the next few years for Iraq. Al-Qaeda is having a bigger role on the ground, and politics are unable to meet around one table to discuss the crisis and to discuss the problems among them. It's been 2 years they've been trying to do this, and they failed. So it's a very, very complicated situation, and unfortunately, it looks really, really bad.
Rachel, if you're looking across the Middle East, what would you say is the country with the best chance of peace or a movement towards peace this year?
I mean, I think, you know, when we look at Iraq, it's certainly worth remembering, and I don't think can be repeated often enough, that there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the 2003 US-led invasion that devastated the country and led to the sort of ravaged and miserable situation that it is in today. But I think what's coming out of what a lot of analysts are saying, and I'm inclined to see sense in their point of view, is that a possible way out of the horrible crises both in Iraq and in Syria, which effectively have become the same thing. They are feeding each other. Al-Qaeda affiliated militants are slipping through a porous Syria-Iraq border to topple both the Shia-dominated al-Maliki regime in Iraq and the Shia-dominated al-Assad regime in Syria. But a lot of analysts have been saying now that the road to peace runs through Iran, which of course is an ally of both those Shia-led regimes. And now that we're seeing a thawing in relations between Iran and the West, there is a tiny glimmer of hope in the possibility that the West will finally let Iran be a part of the negotiations that could bring about a political solution to the crisis in Syria with the Geneva talks. And a political solution is the only way out. Unpalatable as it may seem, al-Assad needs to be part of those negotiations, and so too does Iran. And that could ease the way towards lessening of the suffering in both those countries.
Shira, as you sit in Jerusalem, do you see Iran as the key in the Middle East to moving towards peace?
Well, I certainly think that once Iran is speaking to the West and once moderate voices in Iran are being bolstered by that dialogue with the West, it's a hopeful moment, and perhaps a rare hopeful moment in 2014. Unfortunately, from Cairo and from other regions, in other parts of this region, Iran is less connected to that, and we're not seeing a lot of hopeful steps being taken in those countries. Iran may be becoming closer to the West, and specifically to the United States, but we're seeing a lot of cooling of relations, as it were, between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and certainly between Egypt and the United States. And those are quite worrying at this point.
Well, Rachel, Mohammed and Shira, I want to pull up a comment here, and I'd like to get all of your response on it. I will sit back and let you have a discussion on it, but let's read it first. An American think tank called the Center for Preventative Action has forecast that conflicts it predicts could pose the greatest threat to the US this year in 2014. And here it's reported on the Atlantic's website, and it includes some of the most discussed, like Syria and North Korea, but also in its top tier of risk are these examples. Strengthening of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula resulting from continued political instability in Yemen and/or the backlash from US counter-terrorist operations. Civil war in Iraq due to rising Sunni Shia sectarian violence, which Mohammed has already alluded to, and growing political instability and civil violence in Jordan triggered by spillover from the Syrian civil war. Mohammed, you've already said that it's so closely linked to the problems in the region, but I want to sit back and get each of you to have a conversation amongst yourselves about whether you agree with those assessments. Mohammed, maybe you could start.
I just want to talk about the role of Iran in the region. If a deal will be reached between Iran and the United States of America, of course it will have a positive influence on the crisis in the region. And of course, because Iran is playing a big role now in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon, it will ease the tensions a little bit, and it will help to reach maybe a bigger political solution. And the political solution is the goal here, but there should be another goal, if you can say this. There is something going on from 2006 till now, which is a sectarian Cold War in the region. Between 2006 and 2008, it was a direct sectarian war, direct sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia in Iraq. And after that, it became like a Cold War, and now it's coming back again. We're seeing this in Syria, we're seeing this in Lebanon, we're seeing this in Iraq, and more and more and more even in the regional media institutions, in the Gulf and in countries like Syria and Iraq. So we need a political deal between US and Iran will help ease the tensions and will have a positive impact on the crisis in the region. But this is not the only thing we need. We should focus also on having reconciliation between Sunni and Shia, because what's happening between Sunni and Shia is of course, it's related to what's happened to the political crisis, but it's also something religious, and we have to find a way to bring them together again.
I mean, sorry, just about what Mohammed was saying. When you speak to Syrians, when you speak to Syrian refugees, especially who have fled what's happening there to Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, one of the things they raise most is whether or not those sort of deep sectarian scars can be healed. I don't have an answer for it, but I do think that there are wounds there that have been ongoing, as you said, since 2006. And as time progresses and as further generations are impacted by this, you're hearing more and more people saying that this is too deeply entrenched and they don't see a way forward to start to heal those sorts of wounds.
But it does depend who you listen to, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, those sectarian rifts are quite profound. But again, let's be clear that those rifts did not exist before the intervention, the US-led intervention in Iraq. What we're seeing taking place now in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and in Iraq, is a proxy war being conducted by Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Iran and its allies. And what's happened is in the last few months, the West has shifted from its ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, to potentially a new relationship with Iran. But interestingly, what you see in somewhere like Iraq, which is consistently polls have shown throughout since 2003, despite all the ravaging sectarian conflict that we have seen in that country, despite the fact that people are scared of traveling from region to region for fear of some sort of sectarian attacks, people consistently show in polls that they feel primarily Iraqi, that they feel primarily unified, and that their allegiance is primarily to the nation. So I think it's a little bit insulting to those nations, to both Iraq and Syria, to say that they don't have a sense of unity, and that this sort of sectarian drum that we keep banging is going to make those countries unravel. But going on to what that analysis from the US about the US threats to the US are, I mean, I think that is not an unreasonable analysis. If we look at the Middle East and the situation in so many of these countries, one of the things that is the most problematic for the US is that it is inconsistent and hypocritical in its policy in the Middle East. So it talks about being humanitarian-led and favoring democracy and human rights, but at the same time it's very happy to back an army that has imposed a counter-revolutionary coup in Egypt and has effectively ousted a democratically elected leader, because as far as the US is concerned, that could be a signal of stability, and effectively it prefers military-led stability in the Middle East.
Rachel, I hope you'll forgive me for jumping in, because we've only got a minute or so before the break, and I want to get Mohammed to respond to the points that you've made.
I just want to say that our colleague mentioned Saudi Arabia, and of course, if a deal will be reached between US and Iran, then we should have a close look at, we should keep looking at what Saudi Arabia and Israel think about such a deal. We know the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we know the tensions between Israel and Iran, of course. And if such deal will be reached in the region, we have to keep a close eye on Saudi Arabia and on Israel. And I just want to comment also on
well, Mohammed, hold that thought, because what we'll do is we'll go to a quick break and then we'll come straight back to you and get that comment from you. But we've got to take a quick break now. But if you want to get in touch with us, facebook.com/World Have You Say is the best way to do it, or Twitter using the hashtag WHYS. Speak to you in a moment.
Let's just say something.
In 2014 in conflict-hit areas around the world. Reading the headlines from South Sudan, Egypt, Iraq and the CAR, violence may appear to be increasing, yet some commentators are arguing we're actually living in the most peaceful age in modern history. Stay with us on World Have Your Say. We'll talk about that.
Talking about it.
I experience.
This is chaos. People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Well, welcome back to World Have You Say. Thank you for your company. We were going to go back to Mohammed to get his point on Iraq. Unfortunately, he's had to leave us. So I'll introduce you to the guests who are with us, and then I want to pull up a video to play. We're joined by Michelle Fall, who is Chief Africa Correspondent at the Associated Press. She's in our Lagos bureau. Rachel Shabi is in London, a journalist and author focusing on the Middle East. Greg Marinovich is an author and Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer and member of the Bang Bang Club, who joins us from Boston in the US. But let's keep our attention with Iraq now and pull up this video, which footage was uploaded to the website Live Leak. It was verified by the BBC's Arabic service. We got them to look at it. Always difficult when we do get footage uploaded online. Many people say it's of a certain area, and we always do have to verify that. It shows jihadi fighters in Iraq. Now, Live Leak said these videos were taken in Ramadi, but our BBC Arabic team tells us that it looks more like Fallujah. They're judging that by the types of buildings and the cars. But it just gives us an idea of the difficulty when people are uploading videos online, claiming it's showing certain things. But it's still an indication of what is happening in Iraq. And I want to get the views of the guests who are with us. Rachel, your view as a journalist and author focusing on the Middle East. In Iraq, what is the future? Where do we go from here? You've said that there's so many links to Syria and other places. Is it the situation that if the situation in Syria is addressed, that things will ease in Iraq, or is that just too simplistic?
It might sound simplistic, yeah, but I think there's also a grain of hope there. The idea being that, you know, the road to stability in Iraq goes through Syria because of the sort of affiliation that Iran has both with the Assad regime in Syria and the Maliki regime in Iraq, both of whom are now facing attacks from Al-Qaeda affiliated jihadists and militants. One side of whom Saudi Arabia and the US were initially apparently supporting in Syria, and one side of which in Iraq against al-Maliki, the West was apparently opposing. So it's a very sort of confused picture there, and it seems like the one way out when it comes to kind of international intervention and assistance in a positive way. One possible way out would be this kind of thawing of relations between the West and Iran, which would bring Iran to the negotiating table when it comes to Syria and the next round of talks in Geneva. The West has always refused to let Iran be a part of those negotiations, but it seems, given its influence and given its power in the region, in particular in those two countries, it seems foolish and detrimental for it not to be involved.
Let's pull up a video here which has been sent to us by Kelvin and Alex in Eldoret in Western Kenya.
I'm Kelvin Kiplimo. I'm Alex Kimutai from Kenya. I believe in the year 2014, there will be no peace in the Horn of Africa, and more so in Kenya. This will be caused by the continued attacks of Al-Shabaab, as we witnessed in the Westgate Mall attack. I believe Al-Shabaab will continue to attack the country. They have found a breeding ground among the many unemployed youth in the country and the poor intelligence gathering by the security organs.
There is also an equal distribution of resources caused by corruption, nepotism and tribalism, leading to segregation and marginalization of some sections of the masses.
I believe the year 2014, if we don't be careful, it will be a very bad year in security terms in the country.
Well, let's get a reaction now from our guests who are experts in Africa. Greg, first of all, interesting point there which was raised about the sheer number of people who are unemployed and how that's really tapping into discontentment.
It really is the major factor across Africa and I think the Middle East as well. But there's just this vast mass of younger people who are unemployed or unemployable and don't have a prospect of a real job throughout their lives, quite honestly. And it just breeds such unhappiness and discontent. And the elites either prey on it for their own use in brief moments of time or just ignore their plight.
Michelle, what's your take on that?
Well, it's very depressing. In northern Nigeria, where you have an Islamic uprising by Boko Haram, The youth unemployment figure is put at something like 80%. And that's, I think, a result of a traditional sort of marginalization of the mainly Muslim north of Nigeria, and especially its education system. And I don't know how you get around that. The government has, the Nigerian government has said it's trying to help by putting money into what are called al-Majiri, which are these Islamic schools. I don't think that's the answer. I mean, I think these kids need a Western type education that's going to make them employable. You know, these other schools teach them how to rabbit on words in Arabic from the Quran that they don't even properly understand. And, you know, and then when they're 16 and, you know, they get a bit too old to beg for the imam who's working with them, they just put them out on the street. I mean, no wonder there's an organization like Boko Haram, and that it just has this flood, this massive pool of very unhappy, unemployed youths with very little hope for the rest of their lives, to, you know, and they can just recruit from them.
Michelle and Rachel, I want to introduce you to Lotfullah Najafizadeh, who joins us from Afghanistan, head of Tolo News, Afghanistan's first 24-hour news channel. Welcome to World Have Your Say. I'm interested, before I speak to you, at the wider issue of chances of peace in your country. If you just pick up on the point there we heard from Michelle about a lack of education and disaffected young people, does that play a role in the problems in Afghanistan?
I think it does. I mean, we are very hopeful that our youth in Afghanistan is going to play a very critical role in the developments that we're going to see this year. The key development is our elections in 90 days from today, and a population of more than 65% of our population are the youth under the age of 25. And this is a new generation that, you know, we didn't have during the Taliban or, you know, during the jihad time. So the youth is going to play a very critical role, and the youth, you know, had better access to education, had better access in outer opportunities in the past 10 years in our country. So I think we're relatively on a better terms, you know, when you compare, you know, our young generation with the generations from the past.
And when we look at the wider issue of chances of peace in 2014, you've mentioned yourself there about the elections. Do you think that is the key, depending on which way the elections go, as to whether there can be peace in Afghanistan?
I think 2014 in Afghanistan is probably not the year of peace, but it's the year of transition. You know, if we have a proper transition, then, you know, it can transition us to a peaceful future. So we have a very significant, a series of very significant events this year, you know, starting with the elections in April, and then, you know, by mid-year, you know, the Afghan forces will take responsibility for the whole country. And by the end of the year, you have troops from 50 nations ending a decade-long combat mission. And all this suggests that, you know, Afghanistan would be, the Afghan government and the Afghan forces would be tested once again. So I mean, there are, of course, you know, optimism, and at the same time there pessimism that how we can handle these series of transitions. But in general, the hope is greater, I think, especially that, you know, we're on track. We have about 352,000 forces, and we had none 10 years ago, and we had, you know, less than 100,000 only 3 years ago. That suggests, you know, a greater development. But again, I mean, peace in our country is related not necessarily to the domestic issues, but to the regional issues as well. How we develop our relationship, you know, with Pakistan, you know, how our relationship with Iran would perform, and if there is no bilateral security agreement with the US, what would be the consequences, you know, whether it's going to create another civil war in our country or not. So we're in a situation which is very hard, you know, to make a conclusion. But this year for us is a year of events and a year of transition. But,
well, Fuller,
but
as you speak to us, I can see that Rachel is nodding at some of your points. And Rachel, I'll bring you in a moment. But I just want to pull up a piece which is on Forbes India's website by Brahma Chalani, looking at which global conflicts will dominate in 2014. He outlines 3 factors he thinks will contribute to conflict this year: the rise of unconventional threats, the phenomenon of failing states, and the growing power of autocrats. I wonder, Rachel, maybe if you want to pick up on that, do you identify those 3 as the real factors this year in conflict?
I think there's something about that. I mean, what we're seeing across the Middle East, a decade and a bit after the sort of post 9/11 war on terror, is that, if anything, Al-Qaeda is in its ascendancy across the Middle East now. The West succeeded in making that more of a force than it was before those invasions in the last 10 years. And, with Afghanistan, just like with Iran, there was this kind of oversimplification of a situation where it was assumed that, job done when the Saddam, the statue fell and he was removed from power. And again, the assumption that in Afghanistan that the job was completed once the Taliban were pushed back, not realizing that actually they were only pushed back, that they were going to make a comeback, as they have done in the last few years. But also what we're seeing wider than that is the kind of recruitment power that Western policy in the Middle East has had on bolstering those groups, from the Taliban right through to those sort of new Al-Qaeda affiliated groups that we're seeing, the Al-Nusra Front, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, that, as a result of this sort of hypocritical foreign policy interventions that isn't just boots on the ground or airstrikes, but is also intervention via allies, Gulf states, or intervention via drone strikes that kill and maim so many innocent people, that all these factors have in fact backfired spectacularly on the West and created more of an Al-Qaeda ascendancy than there was before there was any such intervention in the Middle East.
Well, Rachel, as we speak live here on BBC World News, lots of comment coming into us. Faculty sent us this WhatsApp message from Freetown in Sierra Leone. The only way to bring peace is to engage in genuine peace talks. If that fails, then you have to use heavy force. And Victor in South Africa, also on WhatsApp, says the international community needs to play a bigger role in resolving conflict in Africa. SADC and the AU have historically failed to be firm in getting a grip on conflict in Africa. If you want to get in touch via WhatsApp, go to facebook.com/World Have Your Say, and all of the details are there. We'll carry on talking in the next few minutes.
No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something. No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Lots of you getting in touch with us from all around the world. Libya, China, Angola, Canada, Norway, Sudan. Thanks for all of your comments. Do carry on getting in touch via Twitter using the hashtag WHYS. We'll want to pull up a couple of comments to get reaction from our guests. There was a piece on Cracked.com last week with the headline, 5 amazing pieces of good news nobody is reporting. Here is one of them. We're closing in on world peace. Even with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the first decade of the 21st century saw the number of annual battle deaths at its lowest ever in history. And here's a column by Fraser Nelson on the Spectator's website. The biggest shocker of 2013, that is, it really is a wonderful world. There's an appeal on for victims of the Syrian civil war who are only too real. But it is the exception, he goes on to say. We're actually living in the most peaceful age in modern history. Interesting point, and many people around the world may disagree with that. Well, let's get the thoughts here from Faisal Al-Yafi, who is chief columnist for the government-owned national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. Faisal, welcome to World Have Your Say. What do you make of those 2 pieces which have been written this week?
Well, it's always important to be optimistic about the world. I think maybe Fraser Nelson is rather looking at the world through the urban jungle of London rather than being on the street in Aleppo where people are dying and shivering in the cold. So as much as I want to be optimistic about the world, and it's fantastic that we do live in this world of peace, according to Nelson, I think the reality of the situation is that there are lots and lots, millions and millions, tens of millions of people who are living through a period of war. And if not living through a period just of war, they are living through a period of deep insecurity, food insecurity, livelihood insecurity.
Greg, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, the discrepancies in income between the rich and the poor is increasing at an alarming rate, and not only in so-called third world or southern countries, but also in the West, in the US and in other places. So I think there's just an entire generational swap of wealth that has to happen in some way to give the youth some hope for the future, or we are facing a dreadful period.
Let's get the views from Afghanistan. Lot Fuller is still with us, head of Tolo News in Afghanistan. What's your take on that? Do you think there are reasons to be positive when you look at those stats, if you like?
Oh, absolutely. I think, there are great signs of optimism, in the world. However, there are concerns and uncertainties. I mean, we were talking about, how failing states could be a factor. In our part of the world, yes. For instance, how Pakistan is doing, with the energy crisis, with the economic crisis, and countries in the Central Asia, for instance, having a serious issue with democracy and can't really deliver on the people's expectations. So these are chances that can erupt, or can be an evolution of a new situation in 2014. But in general, I mean, the world is in a better shape. I think we're on the right track, even in what is happening in the Middle East. It's for a better cause, to promote democracy, and in the end of the day, for a greater involvement of people. Even in places like Afghanistan, I think the progress has been very significant. But I mean, the road is bumpy, so you have issues ahead of you, and you have to pay sacrifices for it. I think 2014, in the end, could be a year of greater developments in a positive direction, for all of us.
Lot Fuller says we're on the right tracks. Faisal, do you think we're on the right tracks? Where do you think the best chance of peace is this year?
Well, I wish I shared the optimism of Lot Fuller, and I think that's a fantastic perspective to have. I worry that we might be slightly smug about the reality of some parts of the world which are doing well, and as one of your colleagues pointed out, some parts of those parts of the world that are doing very well. I think I'm always optimistic, not about the politicians, but about the people. And I think one of the ways of looking at the Middle East is not to say, where are we going to find peace in 2014? We probably won't find it in many countries, but to say, where will we find progress in 2014? And I think there are lots of reasons to hope that in some of the greatest flashpoints in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, we will find some prospects for progress, if not necessarily for peace.
I do agree with Faisal about, that it really very much depends on the eyes with which you're viewing the world. I mean, obviously for Iraqis, 1,000 of whom are killed every month or have been in the last year, the world is not a more peaceful place. But it also depends on how you define battle. And I suspect what's happened is that perhaps commentators making those claims haven't caught up with the shift in war that has taken place. We see it especially across the Middle East, where we don't really have the sort of conventional battles of, one army meeting another, of boots on the ground, of, Western forces on foreign soils, so much as proxies and different ways of fighting those wars. So people are still dying and being maimed and being
Rachel,
displaced.
I'm going to have to jump in, and I'm really sorry to do that. It's so annoying, I know, for people watching around the world, but that's all we've got time for. I do hope you'll tune in same time next week.
Let me say something.